Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. I'd like to invite you to join me on the next Legal Lines. My guest is my law partner, Sean Fagan. What's a law? A law is an exercise of power by a government over people, places, and things. In the beginning of the founding of this country, our founders did not trust power to be in the centralized government in very few hands. So they chopped it up between the executive, the president, the Congress, and the judiciary. Today, things seem to be chopped on its head because now the federal government is more powerful, seemingly, than states and the people.
It's time now for Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I have a Legal Lines tip for you. Remember, knowledge is power, and I want you to know if you're injured and you have lost wages because of that injury, Louisiana law gives you a claim for that loss. Typically, it's going to require medical evidence from a medical doctor stating because of your injuries, you can't work. Pretty simple claim. If you had a job before the injury, doc says you can't work from the date of the accident, and 3 months later he says you can work, you can figure out what you've lost in wages. Circumstances occur, however, when the injury results in permanent physical and functional limitations. Now you can't do the job, according to the doctor, that you could do before the accident. So the question becomes, is there any work you can do, and what is the difference in wages? But the court doesn't just look at what you earned in the past, it also looks at your earning capacity. That is your ability to earn wages in the future, promotions, additional education. So my Legal Lines tip from me, Locke Meredith, to you is make sure you know your rights when you're presenting that lost wage claim.
This has been Legal Lines Tips.
Hello, welcome to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith, and this is kind of a unique show. I'm very pleased to have back on the show my law partner, Sean Fagan.
All right.
Sean, let's dive in and talk about this. We're lawyers. We deal with laws all day long. We've done it for cumulatively almost 60 years with our experiences combined. So, you know, I've often told folks that a law is an exercise of power over people, places, or things by a government or another person, but typically it's going to be a government in the context of America. Let's talk about how America is unique to all other circumstances of governments or kings or dictators controlling folks in the history of the world.
Well, I mean, obviously, what makes America unique is the way we elect our officials. We're a representative government. So we don't have a chance to walk in ourselves, but we elect people to go in and presumably speak for us in a way that we want them to speak.
And the preeminent document is, of course, the United States Constitution. And the Constitution is the document that basically says there is power that is going to be exercised by either individuals, state governments, or a federal government or a federal government. And the founders of this country so distrusted having a single person in control or even a few limited people in control called the government that they chopped the power up 3 ways. How was it done?
Well, through our Constitution, and of course the big difference is that if we look for the English culture, you didn't elect people to go to Parliament. And so the Congress, well, before the Congress was even really fully formed, as they formed the Constitution, they said, well, look, we're going to have a representative government, we're going to have the people elect representatives come in. And the history behind it is really what, in some ways, is lost today.
Right.
You know, it's frustrating because we look to see are we really being represented by the people that we elect? Right. And I think that's a question more and more asked. You know, but the history behind the actual Constitution was from the Magna Carta, which basically, as you said earlier, they didn't want to have a king.
Right.
And they wanted
they've been terrorized.
Yeah.
By a government king, the King of England.
Mm-hmm. So what you had was the Federalists, which wanted a strong federal government, and the Anti-Federalists. And I think it was Madison, if I'm not mistaken, who wrote essentially the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that were going to say that the federal government was the exception when it came to power rather than the rule.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but as I recall, you actually worked in D.C. for a United States Senator for a while.
Correct. Yeah, I worked for Senator Tribble.
So you got to see the process at the ground floor in a lot of ways. And the way that the Constitution, number one, made sure that all of the representatives were just that, representatives, required the population to vote. It divided the power between the president. It divided the power also to the
Judiciary.
Congress, and then it gave power to the judiciary. So there's chopped it up three ways: the president, Congress, and the judiciary, the courts. And even in Congress, they chopped it up two ways. You had the Senate and you had the House of Representatives. And the way to make sure that they were the president was elected by the population, the senators were elected every 6 years, and the representatives every 2 years. So these folks are very accountable to the population, or more accountable to the population. And representatives, poor guys, ladies, have to run every 2 years. I mean, they gotta be, they're pretty much on the hook if they screw up. The only exception to accountability is the judiciary, because they're appointed for life, their entire life, and they can't be replaced except for unusual circumstances, very unusual circumstances. So that's how they chopped up power. So let's discuss each of the functions of what was the organization or group of folks that received that power.
Well, on the state level, of course, you have most of the judges are elected.
Well, let's do this forward. Let's start with the federal government first, because it's been turned upside on its head.
That's right.
The bottom line in the beginning, the Constitution says power comes from God. God gave individuals power. The individuals gave the power to their local governments, the cities, the councils, the states, and then those states gave power to the federal government. And the ones who were supposed to have the most power were the people in the local governments in the states, and not the federal government. It's just been switched around. So let's talk about the federal government and its three components.
Well, again, you've got the executive branch, which is their job. We'll back up. Congress has the job to write the laws. They also have the power of the purse. So not only do they write the laws, but they have the power to decide what money is going to be spent so that the laws can be implemented.
Well, and including the power of the purse is the power to tax.
Correct. And so the executive branch, the president, and all the departments under him in the executive branch, their job is to implement or execute the law.
So Congress, the House, let's say somebody writes a bill and they get enough support, a majority vote takes place, it becomes accepted and passed, then it has to go to the Senate. The Senate, they vote on it. If it passes, then it goes to the president, and he can either veto it or he can sign it, and it becomes a law. Now let's say he vetoes it, what happens?
Well, if he vetoes it, then it has no effect at all. It goes back to Congress to square one. They can rewrite a new law, ignore it altogether.
But the exception to that is if a supermajority
correct.
of the legislative body voted for it, then it's overridden. The veto is overridden.
Rare that it happens.
Very, very rare
because
these days.
it takes a lot of power within the Congress to be able to do it. But then once that, if it's vetoed, it goes back, starts at square one unless it's overridden. If it's implemented into law, then at that point, the executive branch decides how it's going to implement it. And of course, we know from our practice that there are all sorts of different areas of law. There's ERISA, which governs a tremendous amount of people, whether they know it or not.
Insurance and stuff.
Well, ERISA deals with employment, all employment benefits, whether it be your retirement benefit, your pension plans, insurance, as you said, all that's governed by a federal law. And what happens is once it gets into the federal system, the executive branch is given a lot of deference by the courts, which is something we talked about before the show,
right,
which is problematic because the courts are the check and balance.
Well, and so we talked about how the legislature is supposed to be the one that comes up with the idea, usually, and says, we don't want this to become a law. And then the president, he signs it, it becomes a law, and he's supposed to do what's necessary for that law to be useful, to be put in force. The judiciary's role is to do what?
It's to make sure that the law that's now been implemented through the executive branch passes muster with the Constitution. Is it something that the Founding Fathers essentially approved of through the document that they wrote?
So the constraint on Congress and the president is the Supreme Court saying what you're doing has not been granted by the very limited powers that you were given, and therefore it's unconstitutional. They're also given the power to interpret
correct
laws. If there's an ambiguity or there's a conflict between interpretations, ultimately 5 of 9 justices will decide what that interpretation is. So we'll continue this on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith Legal Lines. My guest is my law partner, Sean Fagan. Be right back.
It's time now for Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I have a legal lines tip for you. Remember, knowledge is power. And I want you to know if you're injured, Louisiana law grants you a variety of claims to make sure you're fully compensated. It's generally chopped up into several categories, the first being general damages. That's going to compensate you for your mental and physical pain and suffering, your scarring, disability, functional limitations, your loss of enjoyment of life. Also, it will compensate your family, frankly, for your loss of affection. It's called loss of consortium claim. Next category is specific damages. Those would be, say, for example, past and future lost wages, past and future medical expenses. You also have a claim sometimes for what's called punishment damages or punitive damages, typically only available when you're injured by a drunk party. Finally, you're entitled to legal interest from the date you file your lawsuit until you're paid and court costs. So my legal lines tip to you from me, Locke Meredith. Make sure you know what your claims are.
This has been Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.